The dominant narrative projects a kinetic threat. Launch on warning, hypersonic glide vehicles, a skyline of fire. This is a deliberate misdirection. The kinetic cost is prohibitive, and the strategic calculus is flawed. An adversary does not need to flatten a city to neutralize a superpower. They only need to sever its nervous system. The primary vector of asymmetric attack is not loud. It is silent. Analysts at CSIS and RUSI have documented the extreme vulnerability of the subsea data cables and satellite constellations that function as the logistical backbone of the entire Western financial system. This is not about warfare. It is about triggering a systemic solvency crisis. Severing these nodes creates the blind Leviathan, a nation-state with unparalleled military might, but with its senses extinguished. No GPS, no swift transactions, no market data, no high-frequency trading. A communications blackout doesn't just disrupt command and control, it freezes liquidity. It makes the record $18.6 trillion in U.S. family debt instantly unserviceable. The objective is not military defeat, but induced systemic collapse. An extended, unpopular war is not a military problem. It is a solvency crisis. Internal analysis from strategic bodies like RUSI and CSIS indicates that for a nation like Russia, the kinetic cost and domestic liability of a protracted conflict create a mathematical imperative to seek off-ramps. When conventional victory becomes financially and politically untenable, the entire strategic calculus inverts. Weakness forces a pivot. This pivot is always toward asymmetry. The adversary's leadership, facing the potential for their own state to unravel in a manner reminiscent of Venezuela's collapse from a position of strength, must reframe the conflict. The objective shifts from defeating an army to bankrupting a system. They are no longer fighting a war of attrition. They are engineering a credit event. The core calculation is brutal and simple. Why spend trillions on a conventional ground war you are losing when you can target the fundamental liability of your opponent? The United States is not being targeted as a military power. It is being targeted as a fragile debtor nation. The adversary's doctrine concludes that the kinetic cost of a limited, shocking first strike is a fraction of the cost of continued conventional failure. This is the launch on warning protocol for a failing state. The motive is not conquest, it is survival. They calculate that a sufficiently disruptive kinetic event will trigger a systemic solvency crisis within the U.S., forcing a catastrophic deleveraging that the American system cannot absorb. The strike is merely the accelerant. The debt is the explosive. It is a zero-sum bid to export their own collapse. The defining mathematical equation of 21st century warfare is this: a $5 million main battle tank versus a $500 FPV drone. The Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, documents this new reality. The kinetic cost of destroying high-value platforms has collapsed by a factor of 10,000. This is not a battlefield anomaly. It is the blueprint for future conflict. This drastic cost inversion is a protocol known as the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting state-level destructive power has been eliminated. It no longer requires a nation-state's GDP to challenge a superpower. It requires access to off-the-shelf components and a clear understanding of an adversary's primary liability. Adversaries calculate that America's systemic fragility, driven by record debt, makes it unable to absorb the economic shock of even a limited strike. The objective is not military defeat, it is a solvency crisis. By forcing the U.S. to spend trillions in response to a multi-million-dollar attack, the adversary executes a perfect asymmetric trade. They are not targeting our military, they are targeting our liquidity, betting that the kinetic event will trigger a financial collapse we cannot afford to stop. The kinetic strike is not the first move. It is the last. The initial phase of this conflict is not being waged on a traditional battlefield, but in the global system's gray zones. CSIS reports identify regional instability, from embassy warnings in South Africa to logistical breakdowns in Canada, not as isolated crises, but as proxy laboratories. These are live-fire environments for testing systemic stress, calibrating the precise shock required to collapse a fragile opponent. Observe the diplomatic realignments in the Middle East. Per the forward, these are not organic political shifts. They are calculated economic detachments. Each broken treaty or new alliance is an act of financial warfare, designed to methodically isolate the US dollar system from its legacy support network. This strategy mirrors the playbook for induced state failure, weaponizing diplomacy to cut off an empire's financial limbs before the kinetic event. Adversaries now operate with a clear blueprint. The engineered implosion of Venezuela, moving from oil wealth to state collapse, provided the field data on how to deconstruct a nation from within. Concurrently, Russia's economy has been deliberately hardened against external shock, as noted by The Guardian, making it resilient to the very blowback it intends to create. This is not defense, it is preparation. It is the financial equivalent of a launch-on-warning posture. These gray zone operations are the final calibration before escalation. The goal is to determine the minimum kinetic cost necessary to trigger a maximum solvency crisis in a nation brittle with a record $18.6 trillion in household debt. The asymmetric calculation is simple. Why face the US military head-on when you can trigger a market collapse that liquidates the country for you? The launch-on-warning protocol is not a policy of aggression. It is a mathematical solution to a time and distance problem. Given the flight time of modern hypersonic weapons, a nation's leadership has minutes to verify an attack and retaliate before its own command structure is decapitated. The doctrine dictates launching nuclear forces based on data from satellites and radar that an enemy attack is underway. It is a systemic backstop against a successful first strike. This entire protocol, however, is predicated on the absolute integrity of sensor data. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS warn of a new vector, the fog of digital war. In this scenario, an adversary executes a targeted cyber attack, not to destroy infrastructure, but to blind early warning systems. The radar screens go dark. Satellite feeds display cascading anomalies or simply no signal. The commander is now operating in a data vacuum. Is this a system malfunction, or the prelude to a kinetic strike designed to disable American response capability? He cannot know. But he does know, with mathematical certainty, that a nation facing a systemic solvency crisis with record debt levels as a baseline liability cannot absorb a decapitation strike. The internal collapse would be immediate. Therefore, the protocol forces his hand. The fear of being blinded and then hit creates an overwhelming incentive to launch based on ambiguous or absent data. This is the ultimate asymmetric leverage, forcing your adversary's own procedures to become the accelerant of their destruction. The operational phase begins not with a kinetic strike, but with a calibration shot. An adversary with a resilient economic base, as noted by The Guardian, does not need to risk symmetrical warfare. They can leverage our systemic liability, the record $18.6 trillion in household debt, as an accelerant. According to CSIS analysis, the objective is to test the brittleness of the system, to apply a precise, limited shock and measure the cascade. This is not an act of war. It is data collection for a future solvency crisis. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a large-scale, attribution-impossible disruption targeting the digital financial nexus. The most probable vector is a cascading power and data failure originating in Loudoun County, Virginia. Home to the data centers, that process an estimated 70% of global internet traffic. The event will be publicly attributed to a catastrophic transformer failure or a solar flare event. The kinetic cost will be minimal. The economic cost will be the test. The adversary is not measuring how quickly the power is restored. They are measuring the milliseconds it takes for high-frequency trading algorithms to fail. They are measuring the emergency liquidity required from the Federal Reserve. They are measuring the political paralysis as factions blame each other instead of a ghost enemy. It is a mathematical equation to determine the precise energy required to trigger a systemic collapse. The test will be deemed a success